All right, so we are back with our next video and we are going to jump into Judges chapter 16. So in this chapter, we once again see Samson's God-given strength being used and exemplified when the men of Gaza plot against him. So they realize, okay, something is different about this man. His strength, he's built different. So we need to figure out what the source of his strength is so we can overpower him. And they use the exact same tactics they used with Samson's wife. They entice her and say, look, you need to figure out a way to get him to tell you what the source of his strength is so that we can overpower him. And when Delilah tries to come to Samson and get him to tell her, he tells her a few lies the first time and she just pesters him so much where he finally just says, fine, my strength is in my hair. If you cut my hair, that's it. I'll be like any other man. So we see that Delilah gets somebody to shave Samson's hair, and then the Philistines come in, and in his arrogance, he thinks, okay, the Philistines are coming in my own strength. I can once again overpower them the same way I did before. But it says in verse 20 that he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. So it wasn't his hair that made him strong. It was the Spirit of the Lord enabling him to do the things that God called him to do. He was created for a specific purpose, and he needed that God-given strength to fulfill God's purpose. But all this time, he's been feeding the lust of his flesh. He's been wasting his life and wasting this God-given strength that he had. And we know that he certainly was not obeying the Nazirite vows, because in chapter 14, verses 15 and 19, we see him disobeying those vows. In verse 15, he's walking through a vineyard. In verse 19, that's when he touches the carcass of the lion. And now at this point, the last thing has been done. His hair is cut off. So the Philistines overpower him. They pluck out both of his eyes. So he's weak. He can't see. And on top of that, the Philistines are now using him for their own personal entertainment. Now he is their source of entertainment by them just bringing him out whenever they want a good laugh. So while he's in this captivity to the Philistines, they bring him out for entertainment one more time, and he calls on God and he says, God, please remember me so that I can have the strength to kill these Philistines. But we see in verse 28, the reason he wanted to kill the Philistines was not to fulfill the purpose God called him for, not to bring God glory, but it says because he wants to avenge himself for his loss of the 2 eyes that they took from him. So he is only thinking about himself at this point, but God hears and answers his prayer and strengthens Samson so that he's able to kill more Philistines in death than he did throughout his entire life. So Samson had to sacrifice himself and pretty much go on a suicide mission to do what God called him to do from his birth. Then we get to chapter 17, and just to get a clearer picture of how far gone Israel is at this point, verse 16 says, in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. The reason this is absolutely terrifying is because people were doing whatever made them feel good, whatever their heart led them to, whatever they felt would please them and make them happy. But if we turn to Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12, we see why this is alarming. So verse 12 says, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. So there are things that we are going to want to do, things that we will desire to do, and they seem right. They seem like the good choice, the right thing to do, but those things will lead us to death. And in the world today, we live in a society that tells us to follow our hearts and do whatever feels right to us. But then if we turn to Jeremiah 17, verse 9, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? So that means our hearts are going to deceive us. They're going to trick us. They're going to make us think we're choosing the right thing. They're going to make us think this is the perfect choice, but it's deceit. Our heart is tricking us, and our heart is desperately wicked, something that people can't even understand how wicked our hearts are. And if you think that's a bit dramatic, all you have to do is turn on the news and see complete depravity, people doing things that they thought was right, things that they thought was perfect and okay and the right choice because something in their mind and in their heart said, yes, do this. This will make you feel better. This is the right thing to do. And we can see that our hearts get us in a lot of trouble. All you have to do is turn on any news channel. So I wanted us to get a clear picture of that context because we are introduced to a very interesting man in chapter 17. His name is Micah, and Micah seems to be dabbling in a little bit of everything. Even his mother is involved. So he has graven images. He has molten images. He has a house of various gods. These are little g gods, so false gods, not the one true God. So he has a house of gods, an ephod, a teraphim, and he even made one of his sons his priest. And at this point, once again, another way we know things have gone far left is because there's a man that is a Levite that wanders around And this kind of makes sense because remember, the Levites don't have a specific piece of land that was their inheritance. They were given cities or pieces of land within the different inheritances of the other 11 tribes. So this Levite is wandering around, and Micah commissions him to be his own personal priest. So Micah says, look, you can be my own personal priest. I will pay you a salary. And the Levite is like, okay, cool. You're going to pay me to be your own priest? Say less. But remember, the job of the Levite was to be in the tabernacle. They were to be concerned about the things related to God. But this Levite is wandering around doing whatever he wants to do and allows Micah to hire him. And then to end off this chapter, we see that Micah says, now I know that the Lord will do me good, seeing that I have a Levite as my priest. So it's almost like Micah was dabbling within all these different gods and different faiths, because he's like, I want to cover all my bases. I want to make God happy and make sure I'm at least doing a little bit of something that's going to make him happy. Then in chapter 18, we still see the tribe of Dan has not taken their inheritance. So they are trying to figure out if this is the right thing to do, if this land should be given into their hands. So as they're wandering around, they pass by Micah's house and encounter the priest. So they ask the priest, can you please talk to God and see if this is going to be a successful journey? The priest says, yes, the Lord is going to give this land into your hands. So these spies from the tribe of Dan go back to the majority of the people and tell them what the priest says, and tell them that they found a house that has an ephod and a teraphim. So they're so excited to report this information to the rest of the people. So the men, 600 men, go back to Micah's house, and they want the graven images, the molten images, the ephod, the teraphim. So they go back to get these things, and then when they encounter the priest, they say, don't you think it would be a better idea to be the priest of an entire tribe rather than just one man? And this Levite is like, you know what, you're right. Yes, I will come with you. So this Levite priest has now abandoned Micah in favor of the tribe of Dan. Then after the tribe of Dan has gotten a ways away from Micah's house, Micah and his neighbors come pursue after the people. And once they realize they're outnumbered, they're like, you know what, never mind. And Micah just takes the L. So the tribe of Dan goes on to defeat the people within this land. They rename the land. Then we get to chapter 19. This is a trigger warning. People think the Bible is a boring book, but this is actually one of the most gruesome and horrifying chapters that you might come across in the Bible. So in chapter 19, we see that there is a Levite that has a concubine. She abandons the Levite priest to go for a life of whoredom. So after 4 months, this Levite pursues her and gets to her father's house and finds her there. And after some delay, they wait a few days and then they're able to leave. As they're journeying along, the Levite servant says, hey, maybe we should stop off in the land of the Jebusites because it's getting dark outside. We need to rest anyway. And the Levite is like, oh no, we are not staying in the land of the Jebusites. Let's stay in the land of our brothers, a different tribe of Israel. They're like, if we stay with the Benjamites, we'll be cool because they're brothers. They're all Israelites. So they figure it's safer to stay with Israelites than it is with a Gentile nation. Unfortunately, they were sadly mistaken. So when they get to this city, initially, it looks like nobody is going to take them in and they're going to have to sleep on the streets. But another traveler comes along, an older gentleman, and he says, look, you all can come stay with me. And then the scene starts to look almost identical to Sodom and Gomorrah with Lot's family and him taking those two angels in. Men swarm around the house and they're beating down the door saying that they need to lay with this Levite man that has come into the city. And the older man opens the door and he's like, no, you can't do that. But I have a virgin daughter. The Levite priest has a concubine. Take them. And the men are like, absolutely not. We don't want any parts. We want that man. And the Levite gives the concubine over, and the men do god-awful things to her throughout the entire night. When the sun rises, all the men have gone. She's barely hanging on to life. She gets back to the house, tries to knock on the door to get in. And once they open the door, she has passed away at this point. Absolutely horrifying. So the Levite priest takes her body home and then chops her body up to send a piece of her corpse to every tribe so every tribe can be aware of the awful thing that happened to her. At this point, the tribes are all ready to gang up on the tribe of Benjamin, because remember, this awful act was not by a foreign nation. This was an Israelite tribe. This was the tribe of Benjamin. And all the tribes are like, we got to get Benjamin in check. We have to go up against them in war. So in chapter 20, all the tribes of Israel gather in Mizpah, and the Levite rehashes the story. He explains what happens, and all the people are like, okay, first, let's just reach out to the Benjamites and see if they will hand over these men that did this awful act. So they reach out to the Benjamites, and the Benjamites are gathering together, defending the men that did this. And they're like, we're not turning them over to you. So once they decide to defend these men, Israel is like, okay, you have to go to war. So 400,000 men from all the other tribes of Israel gather together against 26,000 men from the tribe of Benjamin. And what's actually interesting about this is that Israel shows that they still know how to communicate with God. They still know what they're supposed to do, because before each battle against Benjamin, they talk with God. So they know what they're supposed to be doing. They're just blatantly choosing not to do it. And it's amazing by God's grace that he even responds to them in the first place. So the first 2 times Israel goes up against Benjamin, Benjamin surprisingly kicks their butts. But the third time, God says, this time I will give them into your hands. So they're battling with Benjamin on this third time, and it starts to look bleak. But then God comes in and smites Benjamin. Israel is able to defeat them, but there are 600 men that survive. So they flee and go hide. Then in chapter 21, all the tribes of Israel make an oath, and they say, we will not let any of our daughters marry the men of the tribe of Benjamin, because clearly these are the lowest men in all of Israel. They're absolutely repulsive. So they're like, we are not giving our daughters to them in marriage. And then Israel realizes that they made an oath and said if nobody came up with them against Benjamin, then those men needed to be killed. So they realized that Jabesh Gilead, the men of that area, did not come up in battle. So Israel has to go fight them and kill all of the men. As a result of killing all of those men, there are 400 women that are virgins that are left after this massacre. So Israel decides to make peace with the men of Benjamin that went to go hide for 4 months. And they say, look, here are women that you can marry, 400 virgins from Jabesh Gilead. You can't marry our women because you all are disgusting, pretty much. So they offer these 400 virgins, and the men of Benjamin are like, these women aren't good enough for us. So they don't even want these women. So then Israel explains how you can go down to Shiloh and essentially kidnap these women and they can be your wives. So Benjamin is like, okay, that sounds like a good plan. So they essentially end up going down to Shiloh. They kidnap these women to be their wives and try to just rebuild after that battle with Israel. And now we move into the book of Ruth, a very popular book in the Bible. So we see a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi. So there is a famine in the land, and Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons move to Moab because there's no food in their land. So they go to Moab for food. Their 2 sons grow up and they marry 2 Moabite women. After some time, Elimelech passes away and Naomi's 2 sons pass away. And during this time, for a woman to be without a man in her home or in her family, put her in a very precarious situation. So at this point, Naomi is in deep mourning, and she just tells the 2 women, the 2 Moabitess women, look, you can stay here with your people. I've heard that there's bread in my land, Bethlehem, so I'm going back to my people. But I think it's best for you to stay here and just marry somebody here so that you're not a woman alone without a man. And at first, the 2 women are like, absolutely not, Naomi, we're staying with you. But after a while, Naomi says, look, even if I met a man today, married him and conceived, are you really going to wait around for my son to become of age for you to marry him? And after that, Orpah is like, yeah, you right, I'm going to stay here. But after that, Ruth clings to Naomi. She's like, no, I'm coming with you. And the way Ruth clings to Naomi is actually a pretty awesome picture of discipleship. So if we turn to Luke chapter 14, verse 33, Jesus says, so likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. So Jesus is explaining what the cost of discipleship is. To be a disciple means that you are forsaking all others to follow Christ. You're giving up everything about your way of living, your way of life, all the people that you love in favor of Christ. And that doesn't mean that you have to force yourself to abandon the people that you love. You're prioritizing Christ above anything and everything in your life. And that's what Ruth did. She chose to abandon her nation, abandon her religion, abandon her family, abandon her friends, all in favor of Naomi. So once they arrive in Bethlehem, Naomi tells the people she has changed her name. Her name is now Mara. And if we remember back to Exodus 15, when there was bitter water, so that's what her name came from, this bitterness that she feels in her heart after losing all the men in her life. She's like, that's my name now. I go by Mara, not Naomi. Then in chapter 2, we see that Ruth has to get a job. She's gleaning in the fields, and Naomi learns that there's actually a descendant or a family member of Elimelech that owns a field. So Ruth goes and gleans in his field. His name is Boaz, and Boaz asks his people about her. He's like, who is this? What's happening here? So Boaz makes sure that Ruth knows, you can stay here, you can work in my field. I'm going to make sure nobody bothers you, nobody messes with you. You are going to be well taken care of here. And Ruth asks Boaz, why are you doing this for me? And Boaz says, because I know what you did in abandoning all your people to stay with Naomi. So this is God's way of showing favor to you. So Boaz makes sure to tell all the men in the field, look, when you're gleaning, make sure you leave some behind for Ruth, just to make her job a little bit easier. So when she gets home and Naomi sees all that she's gathered, she's like, where did you work today? And Ruth tells Naomi, I gleaned in Boaz's field. So when we get to chapter 3, Naomi is like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the time. So it seems like Boaz might be feeling you. So here's what you need to do. So she explains to Ruth how she needs to prepare herself, how she needs to wait until a specific time, go into Boaz's place, uncover his feet, and lay there. And when Boaz sees her, initially he's a bit startled, but then he realizes what is needed in this situation. And he says, look, this sounds like a cool plan. I would be happy to follow through and marry you, but there is a closer relative than me. So I have to check with him first, and then I will get back to you. But I'm down. If this other person can't fulfill the duties, happy to do it. So Ruth stays in this place during the night, and then the next morning, she explains to Naomi what the plan is going to be. So in chapter 4, Boaz goes and speaks to this closer relative in the midst of witnesses and elders of Israel and explains what's happening. He says, look, Elimelech's wife Naomi, she is selling a piece of land, and you're first in line to get it. Do you want it? And initially the guy is like, absolutely. And then Boaz is like, okay. But if you take the land, you also have to take Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth, because all of Naomi's sons passed away and they need somebody that is able to have children to carry on the name of Naomi's late son. So if you take the land, you have to take Ruth, and you have to help her conceive, and that first child will carry on the name of Naomi's late son. Okay, now what do you think? And the man is like, oh yeah, never mind. I don't want that situation to interfere with my inheritance. You got it. So Boaz ends up coming back to Ruth. He marries her, and they give birth to their child. Their first child ends up being the grandfather of King David. Now, this is an awesome book, and people usually look at this book when they think about Christian dating or courtship or whatever that is, and picturing a godly love. Awesome. But let's talk about how this book also is a beautiful picture of our salvation, the salvation of the church. Number 1, humans are born cursed. And we see this in Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And Naomi felt cursed because she lost all of the men in her life. Number 2, Christians heard the good news that God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die to remove all of our sins. And Naomi heard the good news of bread in Bethlehem, bread in her hometown. And the name Bethlehem literally means house of bread, and Jesus calls himself the bread of life. So we see this in John chapter 6, verse 35. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Number 3, we left Satan and sin behind in favor of serving Christ and giving our lives to him. And the same can be said for Ruth when she gave up her life as a Moabitess woman, serving their gods in favor of following Naomi and serving the one true God of Israel. Number 4, after our salvation, we went on to live lives where we're hopefully serving Christ. And now that Ruth has given her life to being a part of the family of Naomi, she goes on to serve Boaz to help take care of that family. And lastly, number 5, the church is the bride of Christ, and Jesus is coming back for his bride, and we will live in eternal happiness in heaven with him. And Boaz claimed Ruth, married her, and restored that family lineage for Naomi, and they lived happily ever after as well. So this really is a story of Jesus's salvation for us, and Boaz being able to not only save the family lineage of Naomi, but also saving these 2 women from being in a very vulnerable position in Israel during this time in history. Then we start the book of 1 Samuel. So in chapter 1, we see another woman of the nation of Israel struggling to bear children. And at this time, she and her family were taking an annual trip to Shiloh to offer sacrifices to God. So when she gets there, she is in the temple. She's talking to God, having a conversation with him, pouring her heart out. She's moving her lips, but no sound is coming out. She's praying silently to God. And she's saying, God, look, if you help me to bear a son, I will dedicate him back to you from birth. And Eli, the priest, comes in and sees her moving her lips with no sound coming out. He assumes that she's drunk. And she's like, I'm not drunk. I'm talking to God. And Eli says, oh, my bad. Well, the Lord will fulfill whatever your request has been. So Hannah and her family go back to their homes. They conceive and they give birth to Samuel. And just as she promised, after Hannah is done weaning Samuel, she takes him back to Shiloh and gives him to Eli, the priest. Then at the start of chapter 2, we see that Hannah is worshiping and praising God for giving her with this son. And then we're also introduced to the sons of Eli, who are two very evil and wicked men. But it says that Samuel served the Lord. And it also says that every year when they came to make their sacrifices and offerings to God, Hannah made a little coat for Samuel, and he was just handling his business in the temple. And every year she just brought this gift for him as his mother. We also see that God went on to bless her with a few more children after that. So she had more children than Samuel. Then we see that a man of God comes to speak to Eli about his poor parenting and what they can expect as a family, because his children are disobedient, they're disrespectful, they're wicked. And Eli has failed them as a father. It's almost like he made his children an idol because he didn't really correct their behavior. He didn't really do too much to guide and lead them. He really kind of let them do whatever they wanted in favor of like them just being happy or doing whatever they thought was right. Again, doing whatever was right in their own eyes. So this man of God says, look, nobody in your family will live to old age. God is going to cut down all of these members of your family when they're still young in the prime of their lives. And God is going to raise up a new priest in Israel. Then in chapter 3, we see that God spoke to Samuel directly. So he tells Samuel exactly what Eli's family can expect. He explains that he's going to pass things down to Samuel. Things will be his responsibility now. Again, because of that disobedience and wickedness of Eli's children and Eli being a poor parent, Samuel is now going to be raised up. So the next morning, Eli asks Samuel, what did God say to you? And Samuel's honest. And surprisingly, Eli says, let the Lord do what seems good to him. So he has no rebuttal against this. It's almost like he knows he was being a poor parent. And he's like, I'll accept whatever punishment comes with that. And then all throughout Israel, pretty much everybody knows Samuel is next in line. Then in chapter 4, we see that Israel is warring with the Philistines. And something interesting happens. So first, Israel realizes that, hey, we don't have God with us. God is not in our presence. That's why we're losing these battles. The Philistines are kicking our butts. We need the Ark of the Covenant. And once they get the Ark of the Covenant, all the people are rejoicing, again, showing their awareness of what's right. They know they need the Ark of the Covenant. They know they need to be in the presence of God, and God needs to be in their presence for them to be successful. And what's interesting is that it seems like the Philistines understand this, at least to some extent, because when the Ark of the Covenant comes, the Philistines are like, oh my gosh, they're concerned because they know the value and the power of God being in the presence of his people. But then they're still a little bit confused because they say, we can't stand up against these gods. So they use a capital G in the scripture, but then there's gods plural. So they don't have a real understanding that there is one triune God made up of three co-equal persons. So they're just referring to multiple gods, but they know that Israel has a very powerful God that did amazing things freeing them from Egypt. So despite Israel having the Ark of the Covenant, the Philistines muster up enough courage to battle them, and they actually defeat them anyway, killing 30,000 men, including the sons of Eli. So after this battle is over, the Philistines steal the Ark of the Covenant, and a messenger comes and tells Eli that his two sons have passed away. Upon hearing this news, he falls off his chair, breaks his neck, and at 98 years old, he dies as well. One of Eli's sons, Phinehas, actually has a wife that's pregnant at this time. So she also hears the news that her father-in-law, her husband, her brother-in-law have all passed away. So all of this stress causes her to go into early labor. She gives birth to a child, but she passes away in childbirth. Then in chapter 5, things get kind of funny. So in chapter 5, the Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant, and they figure the best place to put it is in the house of Dagon, one of their gods. So every day when they come in, they actually see that this god Dagon has bowed down before the Ark of the Covenant. And eventually the head and the hands are cut off of this god. Obviously, God is the one true God. So all other gods, every knee is going to bow before him, including these other false gods. Also, at this point, the Philistines are being tormented because the Ark of the Covenant is not theirs. The God of Israel is not the God of the Philistines. So God surprisingly tortures the Philistines with what scripture says are emerods, and that's the ancient term for hemorrhoids. So God is like, you know what can I do to get these Philistines back for taking the Ark of the Covenant? I know what sucks. Hemorrhoids. Who thinks of that? That's hilarious. So the Philistines are passing off the Ark of the Covenant to different cities. And they're like, look, we stressed over here. We got hemorrhoids. Men are dying. You take the Ark of the Covenant. And then the next city, they're like, we got hemorrhoids. Now people are dying here. You take the Ark of the Covenant. So they're passing it all along because they're being tortured and tormented for having the Ark of the Covenant, something that does not belong to them. So in chapter 6, after the Philistines decide, you know what, this Ark of the Covenant needs to go back where it belongs, they consult their priests and diviners and say, look, this needs to go back to the Israelites. How do we go about this? And the priests say, okay, if you're going to send back the Ark of the Covenant, first off, you need to make a new cart. You need to send this ark back with a trespass offering. And the trespass offering is going to be an image of 5 golden hemorrhoids. Hilarious. And 5 golden mice. So these 5 hemorrhoids and 5 mice actually represent the different lords of the Philistines. And then they also have to tie 2 calves to this cart to pull it where it needs to go. So the Philistines do everything that they're told to do, and eventually the Ark of the Covenant arrives in the land of Joshua. And at this time, the Levites are offering burnt offerings and making sacrifices because the Ark of the Covenant is back. The problem is they looked inside the Ark of the Covenant, and because they did this without God's permission, 50,000 men die. And at this point, Israel is terrified. And they're like, look, okay, we were excited, but we don't want this anymore. So they hand the ark off to the people in Kirjath Jearim. So in the next chapter, we see that the care of the ark is given to Abinadab. His son is cleansed and put in a position where he's able to manage the ark. And the ark actually stays there for 20 years. Then Samuel speaks to the people and he says, okay, all you have to do is repent, stop engaging in this idolatry, and God will help you. He will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. So all the people, they're gathered together, they repent, they turn away from idolatry, and everybody's fasting. The Philistines see that all the Israelites are gathered in one place. So they're like, okay, cool, easy target. So they come for the Israelites. The Israelites see that all the Philistines are coming after them, so they're terrified, and they say, Samuel, please call out to the Lord for us. And Samuel does, and God actually hears. So as the Philistines are approaching, God sends a great thunder to kill many Philistines. He's knocked them off their balance, so now the Israelites are able to kill them. So they conquer the Philistines, and they're able to restore and get back that land that the Philistines stole from them. Then in chapter 8, we see history repeating itself again because we're introduced to Samuel's sons who are wicked, just like Eli's sons. And then we also see that on top of all of this wickedness, idolatry, the foolishness that Israel is engaging in, they now ask Samuel to make them a king, which is what God predicted back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. So this is not a surprise to God, but Samuel is hot. So because God sees that Samuel is upset, God is like, look, give them what they want and don't trip. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, which is way worse. So God is like, don't be upset with them. Just give them what they want. So Samuel goes on to explain all the character traits of this king that they're going to have. Their children will end up serving the king and giving the king whatever he wants and meeting all the needs of the king. Samuel goes on to say, on top of that, you're going to get fed up with this king. You're going to be sick and you're going to ask God, please take this king away, and God is going to ignore you. And the people are like, look, quiet with all of that. Give us the king. They're like, Samuel, stop all this talk. We don't care. We're trying to look like the other nations. And what's so crazy about this is Israel was meant to look different. They weren't supposed to be like the other nations. They were supposed to have God as their king, but they wanted to look like the other nations. So God is like, give them what they want. Remember, we talked about this. God will give you what you're communicating to him you want, whether that's verbally or with your actions and your heart. So in chapter 9, we're introduced to Saul, and Saul is described as a choice man, a good man, a man that's better than any man in all of Israel. And we also see that he is physically tall. So Saul goes on a journey with a servant because his father's donkeys are missing. So Saul goes on this journey to find these donkeys. Him and the servant cannot find them. So the servant is like, hey, I heard about this man of God, this prophet, And I think if we go to him, he might be able to lead us in the right direction. What's interesting about this is that before this even happened, God communicated to Samuel the day before that the person that will be the king of Israel is going to come to you. So Samuel was given a heads up about this. Saul comes to him and God tells Samuel, this is the one I was telling you about. Before Saul even asked Samuel a question about the donkeys, he proves that he's a prophet and knows God's word because he speaks about the donkeys before Saul even had a chance to ask him about them. He says, oh, by the way, your father's missing donkeys have been found. Don't worry about it. So Saul didn't even ask him about it and he already knew. And then Samuel goes on to explain to Saul that you are who all the people of Israel has been looking for. And Saul is like, me? My family comes from the smallest, weakest tribe. On top of that, my family is the lowest of the low in the tribe. You sure you're talking about me? So Saul shares a meal with Samuel, and before he leaves, Samuel says, look, I need to show you the word of the Lord. In chapter 10, Samuel anoints Saul with oil as king, and he also explains to him all the things that are going to happen that will serve as signs so that Saul knows that God has chosen him to be the king of Israel. So he says, you are going to prophesy. The Spirit of the Lord is going to come upon you. And in the midst of other prophets, you're going to be prophesying as well. And Samuel says, when all these signs happen, this is how you'll know that the Lord is with you. So go to Gilgal, wait for me for 7 days, and when we meet there, we'll offer burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. So God gives Saul another heart. Everything that Samuel prophesied comes true. And then Samuel goes and speaks to the people and pretty much condemns them for choosing a king when God was supposed to be their king. So Samuel introduces everybody to Saul and say, this is the king that you have chosen. Then in chapter 11, we're introduced to an Ammonite named Nahash. So Nahash comes up to the men of Jabesh Gilead, and the people of Jabesh Gilead approach him and say, look, let's make a covenant. And Nahash is like, cool, we can do that if you allow me to pluck out all of your right eyes. And the men of Jabesh Gilead are like, hold on, give us about 7 days and let's see if we can find some help to fight against you, because that don't sound too good to us. So the men of Jabesh Gilead reach out to Saul, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul. And he takes an oxen, a yoke of oxen, he chops it up into pieces and sends the pieces of the oxen out into the different tribes. And he says, look, if y'all don't come when I summon you regarding this battle, this potential battle we're about to get in, this is what's going to happen to your oxen. And this little scare tactic works because everybody shows up. So there are 330,000 men gathered to battle, and they tell Jabesh Gilead, look, we coming tomorrow. We're going to help you. So they get there the next day and they conquer all the Ammonites. So after Israel sees that Saul seems like a pretty good king, he helps them win in battle. Then the people are like, hey, Samuel, who were those men that doubted that Saul could be our king? Let's find them and kill them. But Saul stops them and is like, no, we're not doing that. So at this point, now the people officially make Saul their king and they offer sacrifices to God. Then in chapter 12, Samuel is trying to wrap up his time serving. And he's like, look, I'm getting old. So let me know right now if I've ever defrauded any of you, if I've ever treated anybody unfairly, let me know. And all the people say, absolutely not, Samuel. You were perfect to us. You were kind. You never defrauded or mistreated us. So Samuel was an upstanding prophet in the land. Then Samuel rehashes this cycle that Israel is in, where God saves them. They forget God. They turn away from him. So God causes some type of tribulation to come upon them. When that tribulation happens, they call out to God. They repent and they say, please help me. And then God is gracious to help them. But then the cycle starts all over again. And Samuel was like, and on top of that, now you've asked for a king. So you got the king you asked for. So all I'm asking and all I'm telling you to do is make sure that you and this king do not forsake the Lord. Stay committed to him and his word. But if you don't, God's hand will be against you for all of the wickedness and the sins that you've committed. And you'll realize what a bad decision it was to choose a king to rule over you. So now the people are concerned and they're like, wait, Samuel, can you please ask God? Please don't let us die for asking for a king. And Samuel was like, look, you're good. If you obey the Lord, you're good. Samuel says, if you obey the Lord, he will not forsake you for his name's sake. God cares about his name and the integrity of his name. So if he's called you his people, he's going to stand by that. But if you turn against him and commit wicked acts, both you and that king you chose will be consumed. So Samuel gives them this clear if-then scenario. If you do this, God is going to be good. He's going to show favor to you. He's going to be on your side. But if you do that, God is going to turn his hand against you and you are going to experience torture and all kind of awful things. So Samuel makes it very clear, just like all these previous leaders have done for them. So that is Judges 16 through 1 Samuel 12. Lord willing, I'll see you all next week. Grace and peace.